Welcome to the XY Advisor Podcast, a global community of financial advisors sharing and learning with one another to drive the positive evolution of financial advice. To get involved, go to xyadvisor.com or simply download the XY Advisor app. This podcast series is proudly brought to you by Russell Investments. With more than 80 years of experience, Russell Investments is a global investment solution partner dedicated to helping investors reach their long-term goals. Russell Investments specialize in multi-asset solutions that combine asset allocation, capital markets insights, factor exposure, manager research, and portfolio implementation. Welcome back to the XY Advisor Podcast. I'm Fraser Jack, and we are halfway through our series on ESG investing, or the focus of ESG investing. And today's episode, we are focusing on the 50 Shades of Green, which is an interesting little topic. So to kick us off, we've got Philip Moffat. Welcome back.
Thanks, Fraser.
So tell us about the 50 Shades of Green. Obviously, there's lots of different commentary going on around this. You know, the deep green, the light green, the middle road.
I got a big smile on my face. Green's my favourite colour, so I'm happy to indulge in it. Look, let me start with an example and try and narrow down, go from the example out to the concept. Let's say we've got a mining company that has partaken in poor employment practices and has a high carbon footprint. And we know that we're going to continue mining for that mineral for whatever reason. Is the movement of that company from kind of poor social and environmental output to relatively better an ESG positive investment or not? So that's what I'd call light green. Light green is taking relatively poor quality asset, judging from ESG measures, and helping it in its transition to become a modestly or a positive asset. Dark green is the other extreme. Dark green is you only engage with businesses that already have best practice in place, understand everything they're doing, they measure it, they report it, and they comply with every regulation. The practical issue from my perspective as a asset manager or as an investor is that the pool of very dark green assets is very small, and the pool of very light green assets is very big. And so in principle, I would be in favour of going to the big pool and trying to find the ones that we can make darker green and help them along that journey than just only fishing in the dark green pool. But it becomes an issue of personal choice. We discussed in the last episode, there will be some people who are ideologically committed to the dark green pool only. And if that's the case, then that's where they should live.
And this becomes an interesting conversation then with advisors and their clients, because it's a bit of an educational process, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you could very easily make the case that I'm going to the light green part of the pool and I'm going to pick some assets that I'm going to try and help improve, but I don't actually help improve them very much. And you're a greenwasher. Like, what's a greenwash? Is it a dark green asset that's actually light green? Is it a light green asset that doesn't get as dark as you want? So it becomes it's amorphous. As much as we would like to say that we've got certain standards, and eventually, personally, I think we'll eventually end up with accounting standards for these ESG measures, just as we have accounting standards for financial returns. And so when you read a set of accounts, you can be confident that they've met certain minimum standards. It'll be the same for carbon footprint or for social responsibility or so on and so forth. We're a long way away from that. And it's an ideological question, really, whether you want to take the whole and try and make it better, or you only concentrate on what's already good.
So where we're at the moment, as you mentioned, the benchmarks are a little harder to find.
Yeah.
Tell us about where we're at in that journey of having a sound benchmark, and at the moment, who decides on the labels? Who decides of what's light and what's dark?
Oh, well, firstly, like the benchmarking issue, the benchmarking is crude. So because historically, the way investors who've been concerned about, let's use the word ethical, broadly, ethical issues have approached this is they'll say, I've got a certain set of exclusions that I won't touch. I won't invest in gambling or armaments or alcohol or whatever it happens to be. So as managers, we're very used to that. Here's a part of the universe, you just chop it off, you can't invest in it. This is much more subtle. This is saying there might be stuff that you don't touch, I get it, but there's other stuff that you might want to touch because you think you can improve it and it's essential and it's not necessarily creating social environmental harm to the extent that you can't live with. Because the standards around that are not as clear as just excluding something. It's like, do I include it or not? And if I include it, how do I justify improving it with measurement and so on? Then it becomes an individual assertion around how you measure it, and there's no unifying standard. So that's where it gets muddy at the moment, Fraser, in the universe, which is that who says something is ESG compliant or a good ESG asset or a bad ESG asset or an improving ESG. It's generally the spruiker of the asset. So that's either the person who bought it or the person who's trying to sell it. And you've got to think of that partly as advertising. Now, hopefully there's truth in advertising, but the truth in advertising standards are relatively minimal at the moment. So, you really got to do due diligence.
Yep. And globally, is there any standards that we can hold our hat to?
Yeah, Europe's much further ahead in terms of kind of standards that are being applied. Even there are not universal standards, but there are more understood and acceptable standards, and they're developing quite quickly, to be honest, amongst the providers of kind of benchmarks.
Yep. Where does Australia sit in that process? Like, how far away are we? Are we sort of just behind Europe, or?
No, we're reasonably far behind in terms of the formality. There are some organisations that are much further ahead than others. I think about, for instance, QBE, the insurance company, has a program called Premiums for Good. And so if you insured with QBE, you can elect for a portion of your premium to go into a Premiums for Good, and it goes into a portfolio that has minimum standards around ESG and green footprint and stuff. So there are places where you can do that. Most of the super funds, for instance, will have a sustainability option. Aware Super I'm involved with has a sustainable option that you can elect to go into. But in terms of broadly applicable standards across the board, no. And that does mean that we're all exposed to some element of less than 50% green or something, being in the light green end of the spectrum.
And so how do advisors work through that? I guess they've just got to try and get that roll up their sleeves and get their hands dirty and try and find the...
Yeah, well, they've got to try and find the assets or the asset manager who provide you with something of the standard that your client expects. So, I would say it's a lot of conversation with your client base about exactly what they actually believe and want to invest in.
Yep. Philip, thanks for being on this episode. Really appreciate it. We'll catch you in the next episode.
Pleasure. Thanks, Fraser.
Welcome back to this episode, Elizabeth.
Thanks for having me, Fraser. It was really good to be able to talk to you.
Fantastic. Now, today we're talking about the concept of 50 Shades of Green with regards to ESG investing, and we're looking at all sorts of different things around how do we actually work out a bit of a benchmark, how do we actually work out what or how deep these funds are going when they're starting to look at, deciding what their ratings are. Mm-hmm. What are you seeing out there?
There's a whole lot of ratings agencies out there that rate according to proxy voting on issues of sustainability. There's the Australian Centre for Corporate Responsibility that looks at sort of governance issues. Then there's carbon metrics and whether and to what extent companies are moving away from being invested in dirty industries or activities that seem to be injurious to the planet. So there's a whole lot of different factors that are involved. And I find that with clients, they often don't know what it is that they're particularly interested in until you ask them the question and give them some ideas about the sorts of things that they could think about.
Yep. Now, one of the previous episodes, you mentioned the idea of the LEAF rating.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk to me about how that works?
Yeah, so the LEAF ratings are put together by a series of advisors from the Ethical Advisors Cooperative, and a number of funds and investments are rated depending on what it is that the advisor thinks that their average client would think about things. For example, some funds say that they've got a certain percentage of capital that's left over from their main asset base that can be allocated to things that are not necessarily deep green, like coal, for example. But some funds that say that they're ethical say that 20% of this type of fund can go to something that is a fossil fuel type activity, and some funds say that only 5% of their assets can go to that type of activity. So often these are because funds can be invested in some of the really, really big companies that are gradually moving away from their exposure to fossil fuels. But 20% is probably more than the average client would be comfortable with, whereas 5% might be something that they think that they have to put up with for a while, as long as they have some conviction that the fund manager and or the company is moving out of that type of investment.
Yeah, well, who gets to decide what those percentages are?
The percentages, I think that the percentages of decisions are made by fund managers and also by companies. And so that's where sort of shareholder activism and pressure from investors comes in. And if there's enough impetus behind what it is that investors are thinking, then a company will need to move.
Yep.
As in the case of Royal Dutch Shell recently.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah. Okay, great. And
where there's sufficient noise from influential investors or loud investors, or possibly both, to make a company change.
Yep. And I guess there's a little bit of social media that goes along with those sorts of activism.
Possibly. I'm not sure. I'm not really in the social media space.
Or just media in general. I think the media tends to pick up on these things if a company is to blame for doing something wrong.
Possibly, but I think that the way that this actually works is that there's a lot of movement behind the scenes and a lot of talking to companies about what they're doing. People are actually wanting some transparency about what a company's undertakings are and how they actually measure up against those undertakings. And I think that there's a lot of noise and marks on pieces of paper, but not necessarily that companies are moving on any of this stuff. And there's a recent PricewaterhouseCoopers review that said that Australian companies are all signed up to all of these changes and making themselves more transferable and accountable, but there's very little action in Australia. Yep.
Right, fair enough.
And that was about last year, 2020. Yep.
Okay, and so really the only way to go is to look for those, as you said, the Ethical Advisors Co-op, or what was the other one? The ACCO?
RIAA, Responsible Investment Association of Australia, and they're pretty big. They sort of set what's regarded as a benchmark in terms of what companies and funds are doing. I know what funds and super funds are doing well, and they're regarded as the leaders in terms of setting these sorts of benchmarks, and that's the gold standard pretty much for what's happening in Australia and New Zealand.
Okay, fantastic. And so it's obviously the deeper you go, and I feel like the deeper you go, you're always going to find something that's not quite perfect in a business or a company that you can sort of. So, is there any really, really deep green companies around, I guess, or funds?
There are some deeply green funds, and they're doing spectacularly well in terms of their financial returns. They're just, I'm told this is the wrong expression, but they really are shooting the lights out in terms of their returns. And those companies are transparent and also quite particular about which companies they will invest in. And there's one fund that I know that a little while ago decided to divest itself of Facebook after the Cambridge Analytica scandal. And there was quite a lot of kerfuffle in the local press about that, saying who do they think they are. However, their company policy said that they look at people's privacy and human rights as a key issue when they decide which companies are going to be in their fund.
Yep.
And they have done, and they're continuing to do spectacularly well in terms of their financial returns.
Yep, fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Elizabeth, for chatting to us in this episode. We look forward to catching up with you again in the next episode when we really start to dive deeper into what is the difference, what are all the different things in the E, S and G, or G I should say, in the next episode.
Okay.
Welcome back, Paul Gunner.
Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you for being here. Now, in this episode, we're talking about 50 Shades of Green, and specifically the idea of who gets to decide these benchmarks. And you sort of mentioned the work you're doing with the co-op and the LEAF rating, so we might go into a little bit of that. But let's start with the idea that often fund managers just have a view, and then they promote that view as their fund and those things. So talk to us about the 50 Shades of Green.
Sure, that's that whole concept of light green, dark green. It is again, it's very subjective, and fund managers will make their choices about the balance between what they're trying to achieve on an ESG level versus what they're trying to achieve on an investment return level. So they'll do that by saying, well, we'll invest in companies, we'll filter out these companies as long as 5 or 10% of the revenue isn't derived from this particular area, for instance, mining or fossil fuels, transport of fossil fuels, those sorts of things. That's the sort of compromises that a fund manager will make to achieve their desired investment returns. So it's important as advisors to be aware of that, and I guess not to make judgments, but to tell them that, okay, well, there will be a certain sector of our clients who have no tolerance towards that area, and therefore this fund for those people won't be appropriate. And we give them that feedback, and so we say that, okay, well, you make your choices, but this is the feedback from people with an average or deep green people won't like that. Lighter green people, that compromise is fine. And it must be a tough job for the fund managers because they've got to make a decision about exactly who they're going to target, and it's up to us to interpret that and then be that matchmaker between the individual and their values and that fund, and whether that will mix.
Yep. Some of the comments I've heard from the fund managers around this, the deep green versus the medium green, and you mentioned this in the last episode, the influence that money has on businesses, and the influence of investor money on businesses. And there's a couple of different schools of this. One is you take the money away from them and say, if you want the money back, you have to do X, Y, Z. And the other comments from a lot of fund managers are, well, we can actually provide influence if we have a seat at the table, and we're actually still invested, but we say actively as an investor that we want to move towards this space. So there's sort of a couple of schools of thought there. There's sort of no right or wrong, I guess, when it comes to, as you mentioned, judgments.
That's right. But you can see whether, if they are trying to influence, you can see that in the way that they're walking the talk, that their voting behaviour in shareholder meetings. You can, are they voting according to what they're saying they're trying to influence?
Yep.
So that's one way we try to hold them to account in that area.
Yep. And we've seen a few Australian companies obviously in the space go, well, you know what, we'll divest and create different spin-off arms and, put our dirty coal or something over there, or put our alcohol over there, and create a separate business for that.
Yep. Well, there's a great example of that. I think more so on the gambling side, because they're a huge part of the gambling industry.
And it's interesting though. It's just because I always sort of think, well, just because you've divested a business, it hasn't cut it out. It hasn't stopped it.
Yeah. So that I guess there's a cynical way of looking at it, and another way, as with anything. Yep. But it's a fair. You can see it starting to drive behaviour, which is kind of good. If you want to avoid that, then it's made it easier for the fund managers to make those choices, and for us
exactly.
as well.
Yes, and it's not exactly a small ship to turn. So, talk to us about the LEAF rating system. You sort of mentioned that in one of the previous episodes with the Ethical Advisors Co-op, and obviously, this has had some sort of effect on the funds.
That's right. We essentially the process is we examine, we decide, okay, or we're approached by, or we decide this fund has got ESG or something of that nature in its title. Let's analyse it. Let's see what's in it, what's not in it, what their investment philosophy is, what their voting history is, who's behind it, what's their track record, or all of those sorts of issues. We try to distill into a summary that up to 20 of us vote on. So our criteria is how would the average ethical investor rate this or view this investment. So 5 ratings would be ideal, down to 1, which is forget it. It's especially greenwashing, and in between. So we all vote on that and then average it out, and that's what the rating is. We then feed that back to the fund manager for their comments, and or just to note if there's any inaccuracies or new developments that we're not aware of, and often. And then we'll screen that. And then maybe in a year's time or so, the fund manager will ask for a re-rating because they've either taken on the feedback and they've adjusted their processes and they like us to take another look at it. So it's a way of holding the industry to account, and also to make sure that we're giving them a fair go.
Yep, fantastic. And so that LEAF rating, if you like, that's designed for consumers to be able to understand. Yeah.
Yes, it's very plain language. It depending on the appetite of the individual to know what's behind that. It has as much information in there for them to make a decision on how green they want their investment to be.
Yep. Fantastic, Paul. Thank you for coming on and sharing that. I encourage everyone to jump on the Ethical Advisors Co-op and check out the LEAF rating system. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Welcome back to this episode, Alexandra.
Thank you so much, Fraser. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, we're talking about the 50 Shades of Green. There's probably not 50, let's face it. We're just using that title. But talk to us about the different shades of green.
Sure. So I think, when you're looking at a fund, the different shades of green, like the first temperature test that I do when I'm looking at a fund is I look at their holdings, and I just even look at just the top 10. And if I'm seeing things like fossil fuel or mining companies, if I'm seeing the big banks, the big tech giants, carbon intensive industries, controversial industries, it's a fair indication that this fund is probably out of the ethical realm and certainly not in that deep green realm. The next thing I would do is look at their responsible investing policy. So does it provide detailed information on their screening process? Does it explicitly state what thresholds they have for inclusions and exclusions? For an example, if a fund excludes tobacco, do they have a 0% threshold, which will probably more on that deep green scale, or do they have a 10% threshold, meaning that they can still potentially have supermarkets that are selling tobacco in their portfolios, and that might be on the lighter green scale. Yeah, so I think they're probably the two, but from there, I would probably go onto their voting records. So first, do they have them publicly available? More importantly, are they in aggregate, or, in other words, all of their funds are in the one voting record, or can I see the voting specifically for each and every fund? Because at the end of the day, if, the fund is voting against increased climate disclosure, it's probably not going to be in that deep green shade. Alternatively, if they are voting against, resolutions around human rights and those kinds of things, then again, not so deep green. And I would probably also look at engagement. And so whether the fund has a detailed engagement policy, whether they disclose areas of engagement that they focus on, do they detail the outcomes of engagement? I think that's a really big one to show, to demonstrate deep green. But this one's a little bit tricky because sometimes with engagement, it can happen with a fund and a company over a number of years before you actually see any tangible outcome. So, it's not a black and white response there for me. But for me, engagement practices are really fast becoming the deciding factor for whether a fund is deep green, whether they're just talking the talk or whether they're actually walking the walk, because it gives you a sense of the culture of the fund manager and whether they take their stewardship role seriously.
That is very deep. That's amazing. Now, obviously, you spend a lot of time doing research, and whilst it rolls off the tongue for you, when I listen to you speak, I think, jeepers, that sounds like it's a big role for a financial advisor to get their head around talking to those individual funds and going deep into the voting rights and the engagement. How do you think, the financial advisor who's got lots of SOAs to write and other things to do in their office spends the time or gets that information?
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. There are certainly advisors out there that are doing that are in this space, but there's also outsourcing to people like me who love doing this thing and can give you the shortened, abridged version.
Is this what Altiorem does?
No, they take research that's around ESG, sustainable investing, and summarise it. Whereas I do fund research as a service. So
Oh, nice. Okay, very good.
Yeah, in my
very
consulting.
And also with the co-op, how does the co-op work in that space? With the space?
So with the co-op, because of all the greenwashing that was out there and the difficulty and I guess the opaqueness of investments and the time that it takes to go through all of this, we developed the Leaf Ratings system. So if you go to the co-op's website and have a look at the Leaf Ratings, what we've done is we've taken super funds and investment funds and conducted some research on that. So we look at, things like the holdings and engagement and that kind of thing. We look at all those areas. And then the co-op votes on the funds from the perspective of their average ethical client. So how would their average ethical client consider the fund to be ethical? And, full disclosure, I am on that Leaf Ratings working group, which means I do get to assist with analysing the funds and producing the research sheets, which are available on the Leaf Ratings website, which is a great, helpful step. I have to say, though, that I don't vote on the Leaf Ratings because I'm not an advisor. So only advisor members get to vote. But for you listening, if you wanted to check out, the highly rated funds and see what good looks like, go to Leaf Ratings, click on those ones with 4.5 leaves or 4 leaves and use that as a benchmark and compare that with the low scoring funds.
Yeah, very interesting. Now, I want to lean into this concept that just because something is not deep green doesn't make it bad.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
So are you suggesting that, that there's lots of different shades of green? There's definitely shades of green and it's not all good and it's not all bad. And it relates to both companies and funds. So there's none that's 100% ethical. If you look deep enough, you are always going to find something. As an example, let's look at Cochlear. It's an Australian company that produces hearing implants and devices. It usually ends up in Australian-focused ethical investment funds because of the positive impact that these implants have on people's lives. But on the other hand, the cost of these hearing implants is quite high and inaccessible for many people. So is this inaccessibility, that's a negative, it's this positive and negative side by side. Another example would be in a fund, they might hold the big 4 banks. The big 4 banks. And on one hand, we need banks to finance mortgages and business loans and infrastructure that positively affects people and society. But on the other hand, the banks are also financing fossil fuel companies and deforestation and biodiversity loss and plastic pollution. And, so if a fund holds these banks, is this fund necessarily, deep green or not green or good or bad or whatever? I think another question to ask, though, is that fund engaging with companies? Are they pushing the banks to reconsider their investment in fossil fuels? And then, of course, that opens the question of, is it better to hold the fund because of the engagement, or is it better to divest? So a whole nother can of worms, which we won't go into, Fraser.
Yeah, that's pretty much where I was going with that, around the fund manager's attitude and whether they do actually influence for positive, or whether they're happy to just sort of sit back and say, oh, that's fine, as long as they keep providing returns for the member. Fantastic, and we'll probably get to a little bit more on that supply and demand conversation. But I think you answered the question. I was going to ask you who decides with regards to the benchmarking, but you sort of mentioned that with the LEAF rating, it's just the advisors who are in the co-op that decide that based on what they believe their clients would expect.
Yeah, and I think that including the client in this response is the most important thing. So if you were to ask me, who decides what's ethical for a financial advisor, my answer is actually your client. Ideally that you would have a questionnaire, you would uncover, what ethical preferences your client has, what ESG matters, issues matter most to them, and even better if, the questions coincide with ethical screens on the funds. But, for me, what I generally say is that the Responsible Investment Association have a framework. It's called the RIA Spectrum, and it outlines all the different responsible investing techniques used in ethical investment products. So from ESG integration to positive and negative screening, norms-based screening, engagement, impact investing. So for me, when looking at what is ethical, this is the ideal framework that I would use. And then how an investment product fits in with this framework. It's even got the ABCs, which I just think I only realized this probably a few months ago, actually, at the RIA conference, that it refers to the ABC. So in other words, how a product, A, avoids harm, B, benefits stakeholders, and C, contributes to solutions. So the ABCs, so it's super easy. So I take this framework, this RIA spectrum, it defines what an ethical investment product is, or what techniques could be used in an ethical investment product. I would then overlay your client's values on top of that, and it's that combination of what's possible plus your client's values that determines what's ethical. And it's going to be, and what is ethical is then unique for every one of your clients.
Yeah, fantastic. Well said. I love that who decides conversation. That it probably takes us a little bit into the next episode where we start talking about how do we talk to our clients and prioritising things. I love the fact that you've referenced that spectrum and the ABCs, and people can find it at the RIA website. Really appreciate it for joining us in this episode. I look forward to chatting to you in the next episode.
Thanks so much, Fraser.
James, thanks for coming back to this episode where we're talking all things around the 50 Shades of Green.
Hi, Fraser.
Thank you for coming back. Now, look, let's get into the concept of the 50 Shades of Green because we sort of mentioned, I know you've mentioned it in previous episodes in this space. How do we decipher this confusing net of, where do we start, where do we stop, where do we sit, and how do we compare?
Yeah, look, I might talk a little about exclusions because that's something that we see a lot of in ESG investing, and so where do you stop? And the probably a great example was engine number one in the US took a position in ExxonMobil, not because they thought ExxonMobil was an amazing company, but they wanted to influence the behavior of that company to transition away from its fossil fuels business. So they've got seats on the board now to really change how that company is operating. And the reason I mention that is, if you exclude companies like Exxon from your investment criteria, then you don't have that ability to influence. So what, in terms of like the Russell House view, on the whole, we think that having positions in securities allows us to engage through our voting, through our lobby groups, etc. We do use exclusions as well. So, we have a tobacco exclusion across all of our Russell funds. We also exclude nuclear weapons as a standard as well. But, in areas that are important, like, climate change, and oil and gas companies, a lot of those companies will be the solution. We do need power and energy for our economies to operate. So having those holdings in companies is often better than simply excluding to have greater influence. I think that's probably a good place to start.
So this adds a new dimension, doesn't it, over time to the 50 shades? Maybe there's more than 50. But we're looking at the concept of saying, well, is it now? Is it in the future? And how far down the future? And what's the trajectory it's on? Not just where they are now and where they've been. Yeah,
look, and there's also client requirements, and they're like, so we have a number of universities as clients, and that their student body are quite influential in terms of how their investments get determined. And as a result, we have launched a separate fund that has harder exclusions around fossil fuels. But that doesn't allow us to have for that particular fund. We can't really engage with the company now. Obviously, Russell has many different funds. We've got over 400 billion globally, so we still have investments in a lot of these companies, and it is the best way to influence behavior. But we do recognize that that approach isn't dark green enough for some clients. They want a kind of harder, darker green type of product, and where we can we can get sufficient assets to launch a product, then we will certainly do that. And we recognize that. I think that's the challenge with ESG investing. People sit at different places along that green spectrum. A lot of our products are kind of medium shade of green to try and cater for the bulk of investors, if you like. But we do offer those harder, darker green products for particular client segments that want harder types of exclusions. When you mention the spectrum, I'm imagining the bell curve in this particular scenario, where a lot of people are sitting in that middle, and then you have the extremes at each end. Yeah, no, I think that's right. I probably would say that the light green is something we don't really like to play in. I think we do see products that are quite light green, and I think that really starts to run into that greenwashing type of area. So we really want to be in the medium shade of green, where we have some clear ESG characteristics of our ESG funds. Be very clear on what they are in terms of product labeling and disclosures. Just trying to avoid that light green, because as I say, that's really where you are kind of falling into the more greenwash type of product. Yep, it's good. It's a good analogy. Now, the concept of you mentioned exclusions, and I'm thinking the opposite of that is inclusions. Obviously, like we don't want this, the away from type exclusion, or we do want this. How much does that play a factor, or is it a bit of both that you really need to we don't want this, but we also want a bit of that? Like, is it a push or pull type decision making process? Good question. Yeah, really good question, and something that we've actually seen probably more recently is the focus on the positive side. So obviously exclusions are the negative for they're the negative screens, but how are you reinvesting that money from a positive perspective? So on the whole, we are using kind of aggregate ESG scores. So how well a company scores on overall ESG credentials. You start to get into areas of other focus areas. So clients might want, well, I think I mentioned in a previous session, exposure to batteries or lithium, education or health. These are the kind of typical positive tilts that you might see in ESG products as well. But yeah, on the whole, most of the Russell products are using what I call aggregate ESG scores, so that we can make sure that the fund has an overall better ESG characteristic than its investment universe.
Yep. And with that ESG scores, the aggregate ESG scores, is there some sort of benchmark that you use, or is it just something that you've come up with, and how do advisors, I guess, compare that to across the market?
Yeah, look, I think it's actually quite a confusing area. I did a piece on this a couple of months ago because certainly one. There's been quite a lot of academic studies on this that shows that different ESG scores vary quite a lot between providers. So what we do, we use our own proprietary metrics. We're using something called the SASB, or the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. So they have a materiality map. So it just focusing on the financial materiality of ESG by sector. So, what's important to a bank on how well that scores from an ESG perspective is going to be different to, what's important for someone like a BHP. But this SASB map is, it's a good independent source to determine what characteristics we should be focusing on, and it really becomes quite concentrated. So some of the old ESG scoring has been too generic. What we're focusing on is financial materiality, and that should lead through to investment performance.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah, so that I'll have to check out the SASB map, but that sounds like it's got a fairly decent accounting standard behind it that you can sort of benchmark off.
And it's definitely freely available to download off their website. So, yeah. Yeah,
fantastic. James, thanks for coming on this episode, the 50 Shades of Green, and clearing up a little bit of stuff for us. In the next episode, we're going to dive deeper into what's behind all the ESG and how do we prioritise those in client conversations. I look forward to chatting you in that episode.
Thanks, Fraser.